We have our speaker, and I'm going to ask Ron to introduce our speaker for tonight.
All right, thank you, Madam President. I have the distinct honor to introduce Kimberly Strassel, who most recently was here to talk to us 3 years ago. Since that time, she's added another child to the brood home. And there's a bio that we found in your bulletin so that you can read about her accomplishments. She's a Princeton graduate, Wall Street Journal editorial board, and also a television commentator on the Paul Gigot Journal Edition report, or Journal editorial report that's on weekly. We enjoyed her comments last time, and so without further ado, I'll give you Kimberly.
I think if this works, I might use this microphone, and if you'll all forgive me, I'm going to remain seated only because I have discovered you want me to stand up. I don't actually do very well walking and talking at the same time. It's a bit beyond me, but it is so incredibly nice to be here. I want to say what an honor it is to get asked. It was actually so inspiring to just get to see an induction too, which I've never seen. Prior to moving down to this area, I have only ever lived in very large cities in my adult working life. I'd been in Brussels and then London and New York City. So this is the first time I have actually lived in a smaller community, and I absolutely am amazed by it. And Rotary is so important. You guys, the amount of work you do in the community and with the community and for community has just been something that's inspired me since I've lived here. So I am very honored to get and come to talk to you tonight. As Ron noted, it's been about 3 years since I was here. We've had 2 elections since then, and I have indeed had another child. It is an open question which of those events was a more painful experience. I would say that at least at a childbirth you get something lasting and joyful, which is not something you can normally say about anything that comes out of the political system. Speaking of elections, often when I'm asked to come speak to groups, it is to talk about an election. There always seems to be one that was just passed or one that is coming up. I am thrilled to say to you tonight that I'm not going to be talking about an election here. We are at that very, very short and rare moment in the American political calendar where we're about a year on from the presidential. We are almost a year out from the midterms, and so I am going to revel in this moment and not talk about polls or voter sentiment or who's running the Senate and what's likely to happen. I thought instead I would rather, instead of giving a big themed speech about the state of the nation and upcoming elections, I'd just instead offer a few remarks about what has happened in Washington over the past few months and what is likely to be happening this fall. We are now about halfway through the first year of the second term of the Obama presidency. And normally at this point, you would probably already have the opportunity to talk about what the theme of that presidency is. And that's because most two-term presidencies, at least in modern history, have tended to follow a pattern. Presidents who win second terms have traditionally, and with very good reason, viewed the opening of that second round as this very brief and important moment to get something of great substance done. You know, they've just been through a grueling re-election that occupied a lot of their time, and yet now they can say a majority of voters did indeed support them again. Their bucket of political capital has been refilled. They often bring with them in their victory greater majorities in their party in the Congress, so they have more support for their initiatives. Sometimes there's a renewed sense of bipartisanship right after election. And most importantly, there's this urgency in the first year of the second term to get something done before everyone does indeed start to think about the next election. If you look over the last 30 years of two-term presidencies, they pretty much all follow this model. Ronald Reagan, after his landslide election, his administration put everything it had into getting what ended up being the 1986 tax reform. Bill Clinton He started a little bit early with welfare reform, but when he won re-election, he went on to get the balanced budget agreement that he did, also to get Republicans to get behind him on his S-CHIP program, which still exists today. It's a federal children's health care program. Even George W. Bush, he ran on, campaigned on, and tried to push through both Social Security reform and immigration reform. He didn't get those things done for a variety of reasons, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. The Obama presidency has been decidedly different than any of this. If you think about it, he didn't really run on a big idea that he wanted to get through last year. While he has talked about immigration as a top priority for the administration, I can tell you as somebody who's in Washington, it is notable that his White House does not seem to have the kind of energy and driving force toward getting that done that you might see in other presidencies, the way that the attention that prior presidents have put on their second-term agendas. What you've seen instead has been a bit more of a hodgepodge of legislative ideas, some of which have come up simply because they've come up. For instance, the gun control debate that happened earlier this year. But beyond that, a lot of smaller things like requests for more stimulus or suggestions for more funding for universal preschool, things like this. What is most fascinating for someone who watched politics is that this is, amazingly, deliberate. The White House has actually let it be known that they are doing this on purpose, that what they are trying to do is flip the usual paradigm of two-term presidencies. And the best way I saw that described was in a Washington Post story that appeared in early March, and I'm going to quote from it. The goal is to flip the Republican-held House back to Democratic control in 2014, allowing Obama to push forward with a progressive agenda on gun control, immigration, climate change, and the economy during his final 2 years in office. So the goal here, again, is not to actually push anything big these first 2 years, but rather to try to win back the House next year, grow his numbers in the Senate, and then as a result have more support for doing the agenda the way he wants to do it. This is incredibly fascinating, not only because it's very bold and it hasn't been tried before, because it's also very risky. If he does not win back the House next year, and in history is usually not kind to presidents in midterm elections, he is looking at a continued Republican opposition to his agenda out of the House and potentially an entire second term that has no big wins. But I think on a more immediate level, which is what is most interesting to me, and a lot of journalists and a lot of observers are beginning to see this, is that the more immediate impact of not having an overriding agenda in the first or second year of your second term has been that this White House has ended up being far more at the mercy of events that have happened and is likely to remain far more at the mercy of events as we go forward. I can tell you as a member of the press corps for 20 years, if there is a vacuum of news, if the White House is not putting out a story every day and driving it, we will come up with something else to fill the news hole. So this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to go through some of those events, what defined the spring and what is likely to dominate the fall. I think in terms of the first part of the year, as I said, we did have a gun control debate back in February. We also had the Senate pass an immigration bill, which was a very notable moment for the country. But the story, the overwhelming story that has dominated Washington throughout the spring was this confluence of these scandals, controversies, political haymaking, and I'm going to leave it to each of you and your own political inclinations to decide how you want to term them, that happened back in April and May. I want to talk about them briefly, in part because they're going to continue to matter, but also because while these controversies tend to get lumped together frequently in the press, it's all one big scandal, the reality is that the big ones, and by which I mean the IRS and then this NSA data mining story, are in fact very different in the ways that they are going to matter in Washington in the coming months. The biggest of these arguably was in fact the news from the IRS Inspector General that the agency had inappropriately singled out and targeted conservative groups that had applied for tax-exempt status. When that story first broke, pretty much every elected official in Washington came out to condemn the IRS and seemed to recognize the gravity of this. In recent weeks, and it's probably to be expected, we have seen this story become far more political You know how Democrats claiming Republicans are hyping this, you have Republicans claiming Democrats are obstructing the investigation. The White House itself made some news recently by suggesting this was a bit of a phony scandal. Two things I want to say about the IRS. The first is that I personally think it is really a terrible shame that this has descended so quickly into politics. Because the reality is, and if you work in Washington, you come to see this very quickly, that aside from the military, aside from the Department of Justice, which has the ability to prosecute you and jail you, there really is no federal authority that has a more awesome and destructive power than the IRS. They can ruin your business, they can take your home, they can put you in jail, they can shut you up in an election, they can pretty much destroy everything that the Founding Fathers said was important to the country. So in my mind, regardless of whether this was done by some rogue agents in Cincinnati acting of their own accord, whether this was a result of some enormous bureaucratic ineptitude, whether this was done on a political order, either way, it's one of the more disturbing cases of government abuse to come out of Washington in decades. And when you add in the fact that this particular abuse centered on the issue of political speech, which is a real basis of democracy in this country, I think it becomes even more grave. And that gets to the second point, which is that no matter what you have heard, and no matter what you might hear, this story is not ending. And in fact, it is only just beginning. And part of that is because it's so disturbing. But the other problem, and I think this is a problem for the IRS, and I think it's a problem for the Obama administration, and I say that only in the regard that it happens to be in the unfortunate situation of being in power at the time that this is happening, is that this could not have happened to a nicer agency, okay? The problem they are finding is that everybody hates the IRS, all right? You can go out there, most Americans, they don't have any interaction with most agencies in Washington. The NLRB, the SEC, no one has dealings with the Ag Department other than farmers. Most Americans just don't interact for the most part with most agencies. But everybody knows the IRS, and everybody hates the IRS. Republicans hate the IRS, Democrats hate the IRS. I mean, there might be some tax attorneys who like the IRS, who work for the IRS, but other than that, nobody likes the IRS. And so what you have to imagine is it's almost this sort of big dam with the water threatening to flow over. And once there's the tiniest crack, the entire thing implodes. It's that whole trust thing, which most of us have dealt with in some regard in terms of our employees who work for us, or our family members. When you have trust, everything sort of trundles along as usual. The minute you lack trust, then you have a reason to go back and re-examine everything. And that is what is now happening here. The minute the news, the IRS, this broke, that the IRS had done this, every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the entire United States came to congressional investigators to start to tell their own experiences with the IRS, okay? And whether or not those experiences were legitimate, and many of them probably were, it doesn't really matter. It's all open for discussion now. And so what we're seeing in Washington, and you aren't hearing so much about it yet, but it's coming, is an exponential widening of this IRS probe, okay? Put aside the question that actually kicked all this off about whether or not some groups were singled out for extra scrutiny. You now have investigators looking at whether groups that already had tax-exempt status were singled out for retroactive investigations and audits. You're looking at whether there are groups, aside for those that call themselves Tea Party organizations, were selected for scrutiny because of their policy positions. You have investigators looking at whether individual donors were audited because of their contributions to particular political candidates. You have old stories being dragged up. There's one group that came out and has now talked about what happened to them in the 1990s by the Federal Election Commission, back when Lois Lerner, and you may know her, she's the woman that took the fifth. She was working for the IRS. She didn't want to testify. She used to work for the FEC. You have the groups talking about the treatment that they received when she was working at the FEC. It happened to them. And speaking of the FEC, just this last week, we had that body come out that the House Ways and Means Committee is looking at whether that organization was doing its own targeting of groups, because they've now discovered that there were emails between FEC investigators and Mrs. Lerner while she was at the IRS. And the problem here, the biggest problem here for the IRS, and even I feel the slightest twinge of sympathy for this agency, is that if you have an organization that is that big and sprawling, there are mistakes that are just waiting. to be discovered, okay? Even if those mistakes were honest ones, they're all going to come out, because at the moment, this organization is getting what you might call the political equivalent of a colonoscopy. I mean, it is just really, really brutal. And as I said, you're not going to hear much about it over the next month. Congress is in recess. There's not going to be any big profile hearings. But even as we speak, there are people pouring through thousands of emails, investigating and having interviews with employees. And you can bet that this is going to prove, I think, one of the more enduring political controversies that has come out in a number of decades. That being said, it's worth noting that this IRS case is largely a question of revelation. This is going to be about a story about what happened in the past, of piecing it together, of informing the public. It isn't necessarily going to be the sort of story that affects future legislation or changes political alignments in Washington. And in that regard, it is in fact very different from the other big controversy of the spring, which was the debate over the NSA database of telephone numbers and other associated spy questions. I have to tell you, when I first heard the story about the NSA, the most secret spy agency in the country, and the fact that it was, spying, it took me about an hour to get my head around what exactly was the news story here. And even today, I still find it all slightly a bit weird. But as we all know, the effect of this has been to bring into the public arena a lot of details about the NSA's program that were not known before. And the bigger effect of this has been to set up a delayed debate 12 years after 9/11 as to whether the federal government should have this measure of power in the first place. What's important is that this meanwhile comes at a very intriguing time in Washington. The White House has been put in a somewhat awkward position of having to defend a program that in fact candidate Obama back in 2008 had a lot of criticism of. Since he's become president, it seems the White House has decided that some of these tools are of value to the administration when it comes to national security. That being said, many, many Democrats remain very wary about a lot of this government power. Not just in NSA surveillance tools, but the Patriot Act, wiretapping, interrogations. What has changed are Republicans. A lot of Republicans have felt on the back foot politically in recent years over questions of national security and foreign policy. It took a beating during the Bush years. A lot of them don't necessarily agree with the president's actions, drawing down troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, but they have been very wary of speaking out because public opinion is very much with the president on these things. And in that vacuum of silence, meanwhile, you have had an entirely new, younger generation of House and Senate Republicans elected who came in the post-Bush years and who have a much more libertarian bent. And you've probably heard from some of these guys, or Rand Paul of Kentucky, Justin Amash of Michigan. And the result, and I think this is why this is very different from what is happening in the IRS, is that there's this new coalition forming. Think of it as a sort of libertarian coalition that potentially has the power to affect some very substantial national security changes going forward. We saw an attempt at this in July when Mr. Amash in the House actually put forward an amendment to the defense spending bill that would have in fact effectively ended this NSA metadata program. That bill, that vote, again with the liberal libertarian coalition behind it, lost by only 12 votes. The potential for that coalition to come together again, to grow and to tackle other issues like military interrogations or drone use or other surveillance tools is very big, and I expect that we will see some very high profile votes on this in the fall. The point again is that unlike the IRS, these NSA revelations are already having a profound effect on the national debate and moreover the political ordering in Washington and potentially big effects to national security. Once we get done with recess, both of these issues are likely to explode again, as I said, and they're going to come just in time, meanwhile, for yet some more government-generated crises. If any of you were people in the room who actually enjoyed last year's Christmas and New Year's where we all waited on the edge of our seats to see if we were going to fall into default or everyone was going to be hit with a great big tax hike, guess what? You're just going to love this fall because we're going to do it all again in an even bigger scale. This is going to be one of the more painful legislative sessions on record. The first of these moments is going to come on September 30th, when the government officially runs out of money. I have lost track of how many years it has been since the House and the Senate have fulfilled their most basic obligation of passing spending bills. It certainly has not happened, I think, in my time down here. I think at the moment there are 13 of these that they're supposed to pass. I think the House has passed 4, the Senate has passed 0. And so what is likely to happen is that come September 30th, Congress wants to get together, pass a continuing resolution. And this is another way of saying that they pass legislation that basically continues to fund the government at existing levels. Now, up to a few weeks ago, the thinking was that Republicans and Democrats would come together to pass a short-term CR and push this off for a couple of months. Republicans, who never miss an opportunity to make a situation far more complicated than it could otherwise be, now have a certain faction of their party who are demanding that any CR also include a provision that defunds the president's health care bill. Even assuming that John Boehner's House actually passes such a bill, there is almost 0 chance that it will be brought up in the Senate. And even if by some miracle it was brought up in the Senate and it got a vote and it actually passed, it would of course be vetoed by the president. At which point Republicans would need 22 Senate Democrats to abandon their president and his signature initiative to vote with them to override the veto. I can tell you that I have a better chance of becoming president than this happening. What is far more likely to happen if they continue on this course is that if Republicans pass a bill that does defund the president's health care legislation, they will pass it, the Senate will refuse to bring it up, neither may budge, and on October 1st, the government will run out of money and we will have a shutdown for the first time since the 1990s. And this is a very big possibility that this could happen. If, by contrast, the Republicans choose not to take this course, we could indeed see an agreement for a short-term CR. All that does, however, I would note, is create an even bigger crisis moment in that it will push off a debate about the longer-term funding of government so that it coincides precisely at the moment that the country is again hitting the debt limit. This is likely to all take place in November. And it will also come just as the government faces the prospect of yet a new round of sequester cuts that are supposed to kick in January. I think what's a little worrisome here is that we are once again in the classic standoff situation in Washington. The Democratic strategy on these types of showdowns up to now, and I have to say it's been fairly effective, has been to say, you know, I'm not going to negotiate with the Republicans over the sovereignty of our debt or keeping the government funded. It's up to them to do this. Democrats come out and say this, and then they don't blink. And that is what the president is saying now. He's calling on Republicans to unilaterally raise the debt limit and also to mitigate the effects of the sequester, and he's waiting. Now, the Republicans did in fact unilaterally raise the debt limit back in the spring, and they didn't ask for anything in return. But one reason they did that was in fact precisely so that they could push all of this off into the fall and have it correspond with the debate over government funding, so they could kind of use a combination of all of this to try to get something of their own priorities out of the president. Because the reality is that they do have some leverage here. The president would in fact like to get one great big whopping debt ceiling increase, one that would last most of the rest of his second term, because he's pretty tired of dealing with all of this. Every 6 months there's a great big crisis and we have to have another one of these debates. It interferes with the things he's trying to pass. It gets in the way. The other reality is that Democrats are indeed very concerned about this newest round of sequester cuts that are coming in January, and in particular their potential to hurt some of their more cherished domestic spending programs. So the Republican strategy here is to make this a very big moment, to sit back, let Democrats sweat a little bit, and then say, okay, we may be willing to maybe cancel some of the sequester, maybe put some more money into your programs, and maybe up the debt ceiling, but only if in return you give us something big that we want. What is it that they want? That's the trillion-dollar question. They have not actually enunciated that yet. It could be, again, some ask for a major entitlement reform going forward. It could be that they ask for something that has to do with policy, maybe some sort of change in the president's health care bill. I personally cannot see how any of this is any different from the fights that we have had in the past, where we have not managed to get any big solution out of this. And so I don't really have much hope that this is going to end well. What I can tell you is that as soon as September or potentially later this fall, this country will once again be facing a white knuckle moment where everyone in Washington teeters on the edge of both a shutdown and potentially another debt limit breach. One thing I would note, and it's just, probably most of you know this, it is worth bearing in mind that when people say that we could default on our debt, we can't really default on our debt for a number of reasons. That's a big misunderstanding, and politicians who tell you that is true, it's not exactly honest. But were we to not be able to, if we went past the debt limit, if the government could not write checks, what could happen? It could severely rattle the markets. It could throw the country back into a recession. It could, and certainly lead to the government being unable to pay plenty of its other obligations, like Social Security, like Medicare. So this is, in fact, a very big deal. And to add to this, again, just for the fun of it, we're going to have the IRS revelations coming out. We're going to have the NSA debate. We're going to have another huge and rousing round of the immigration discussion when the House picks it up. We're going to have a continued fight over the Farm Bill. And we will also have, just to make things really, really interesting this fall, the official debut in October of the President's healthcare exchanges and all of the things that go with that, the changes in premium costs, the changes in plans. Depending on your political persuasion, this is either going to be not very much of a big deal, or it's going to be one of the biggest healthcare debacles of all time. All I can say is that I'm glad it's still August. I was telling my husband the other day, if I had any idea this was coming, I would have saved up all of my vacation time for the last 5 years and used it to take the rest of the year off. But to go back again to how I started this, here we are, year one of the president's second term. And what we're finding is that it's looking very much exactly like the past 2 years. Washington has pretty much since 2010 been lurching from one crisis to another, using the brief lulls in between those cliffhanger moments to try to do something small of substance. I think there were a lot of people that were hoping that the launch of this second term was going to somehow change that dynamic. But what we are finding so far is, in fact, there doesn't seem to be anything sort of orderly or planned or agenda-driven about this second term so far. This rather appears to be the new norm in Washington, these series of crises. And what changes the dynamic, I have to tell you, I'm not quite sure. It could be that it is some other, again, dramatic election, but I'm not going to talk about that because I said I'm not going to talk about elections tonight. I actually think I'm going to stop there. This has been a bit of a hodgepodge of an overview, but as I just mentioned, in some ways that's actually an accurate reflection of what is also happening in Washington. I thank you very much for the time that you've given me tonight, and I'm very happy to answer any questions, election related or otherwise, if you have any. Thanks. Okay, yes.
Monday, we were all awakened to the shocking news that the Washington Post had been sold. What do you think the successor to the Washington Post will look like under Jeff Bezos?
You know, I would hope, I was thrilled to hear this news. I mean, as someone who works for a newspaper who had a well-moneyed individual take over the Wall Street Journal a while ago, you know, newspapers are suffering from capital and they're suffering from innovation, and they need both of those things to survive in a new world. I remember only about 8 or 9 years ago, the Wall Street Journal still devoted something like 10 pages of its back pages to publishing the stock tables. I mean, does everyone remember these days? It seems so ancient. You know, you pick up your phone and you get your stock price by the second these days. That gives you a measure, an indication of how the news world has changed. And what's nice to see about what Bezos is doing is he seems interested in putting money into this venture, and he has the platforms, digital platforms, to potentially do something new and different with the Post. And to the extent that anyone wants to invest in old media, I'm a big fan of that. I don't know what it might mean in terms of the Post's political inclinations or anything like that, but it should mean that they have a more solid financial footing. And that also, by the way, means more competition. There are just too few newspapers around these days of good value, and the more we have, the better journalism should be.
Thank you.
Yes.
A few weeks ago, the Obama administration announced that they were going to delay the employer mandate on Obamacare, which requires all employers with 50 or more employees to provide health insurance, we also pay a tax of $2,000 per employee. They put that off until 2015 instead of 2014. How is the president able to do that without getting congressional approval? Isn't this a statute that Congress passed?
It is indeed a statute that Congress passed, and you have indeed put your finger on the big question in Washington, is how can you just unilaterally change the law? Now, the White House claims that they have the authority, and if they can't be ready in time, then they can't be ready in time, and that's just the way it is. I mean, it seemed to go a bit farther than that in that it officially is delayed for a year. But there are growing questions. I mean, this does seem to be something this administration does more frequently than others, which is it sort of says, we don't like this part of the law, we're going to do it this way. And that has become a bit of a political thing in Washington. Now, in fairness, plenty of presidents have in the past sort of taken a certain amount of license in, interpreting the laws that they look at. But this does seem to be on the outer edges of just saying, we're not going to do what the law very specifically says that we have to do. I think the bigger question is how you actually administer any other part of the law if you're not doing this aspect of it, in that the employer mandate was basic to the functioning of the president's healthcare law, and that the employers are supposed to be ground zero of collecting information about who actually has health insurance and who does not, which of course is a big important question of who has to, complying with the individual mandate and whether or not you pay a penalty, whether or not you qualify for subsidies based on the other health care that you get. If the business world is not reporting any of this information, we're going to have a system that is entirely based on trust. and that's an awfully big program to be running on trust. Yes, sir.
Back in the early 70s, we went through a period called a transition quarter, and it changed the fiscal year from June 30th to September 30th. This was to ensure that Congress could pass their budget bill. What do we have to do to hold them accountable for that?
Well, I mean, I think this gets to, this has been this new question in Washington recently. What do we do about a Congress or a White House that won't follow the law? Congress is obliged under the law to pass these spending bills, and it just doesn't do it. There has been talk about balanced budget agreements or some sort of bigger framework that would include some sort of penalties for Congress if it can't get its act together and do it. Docking people's pay, for instance. The sort of stuff that would happen to average Americans in the rest of the world if they didn't get their job done at the time that they were supposed to get their job done. But this is sliding. Look, the White House is officially under the law obliged to submit a budget by a certain time each year. I think it's in February. I think they were 2 months late this year submitting a budget, and they were a month late last year. Deadlines, laws, this all seems to be not a big concern to anybody in Washington these days.
One more question.
Yes, he had his hand up.
First of all, I'm probably the only person in this room who does on the IRS.
He's a tax attorney, I'm told.
Right.
He is. I've been in business for 40 years now. I hope they keep going. They're doing a great job right now. Actually, I had a couple questions. One of them is, Lois Lerner, how can it be that a government employee can plead the fifth and then go on paid administrative leave? I mean, no other business would do something like that.
Yeah. Was there another one?
What happened to Benghazi? I mean, that's like the drops, That,
Oh, Benghazi.
yeah.
Yeah, I purposely didn't get into it. Well, okay, so Lois Lerner. People are very unhappy about the IRS's decision to put her on paid administrative leave. This appears to have to do with something complicated about how difficult it is, in fact, to fire her, which is a more ongoing and pressing problem across all levels of government. What you do with an employee that you don't want anymore, it can sometimes be extremely costly and engender a lot of lawsuits if you try to get rid of them. So I would imagine that Lois Lerner was requested to resign, and it would appear that she said no. And so they're sort of stuck with what they're stuck with. I didn't get into Benghazi, but Benghazi is one of those things. About what we do know about Benghazi is that what we heard is sort of the first 4 or 5 days after what happened does not appear to be everything that happened or in the entirely sort of absolute account of what happened. The problem with Benghazi is we don't yet know what did happen. I mean, and this investigation is still going on. And this is becoming, in fact, increasingly more complicated. As some of you may have seen in the news, it now looks as though several dozen of the employees on the ground in the consulate and Benghazi, when the attack happened, worked for the CIA. And so it would appear that this facility was being used for a number of different purposes. This probably accounts to some degree for why we haven't heard everything about what happened and what the security procedures were, and that because this is a more complicated question that a lot of people have an interest in making sure, doesn't necessarily get spilled out everywhere. But there has been some interesting reporting on that recently. And given that it does seem to involve some of the more quiet agencies of government, I don't know if anytime soon we're going to get a kind of full answer on what happened there.
We're going to give Jake the last word.
Real quick comment. Kimberly's involvement with Rotary goes way back. She was a Rotary Scholarship winner.
Again, all credit to you guys. That was an immensely important thing to me. My parents did not earn much money. And Rotary Scholarship did help me fund my first year of going to Princeton. We got a financial scholarship, but that went a huge, long way toward helping me be able to fly home and get my books and do the things I needed. So groups like yours help a lot of kids do a lot of important stuff.
Thank you. Really, we have a little gift for you.
Oh, wow.
Now that you've spoke of Princeton, the mascot for Princeton is
The tiger.
the Tigers. We have a tiger, and this tiger is a special tiger because the tiger cleans off your computer screens. He has a little belly that cleans off, and we assume that you use the computer a lot, whatever kind it is, and so this is a small, sort of corny token of our appreciation to you.
Thank you.
So,
It's
here's
much,
your little tiger.
much appreciated too, because I eat on the computer, I spit an alarm on the computer, the children are on the computer wiping their fingers on it, so this is very helpful.
Thank you again. So now we're going to turn it over to our Sergeant at Arms, Melissa.